My new director looked me dead in the eye across that conference table and said, "Frank, the future of this company isn't built on 20-year-old methodologies. If you can't evolve, maybe Hartfield BioSciences isn't the right fit for you anymore." He said it the way people say things when they've already made the decision and they just want you to do their dirty work for them. He wanted me to quit. Save him the paperwork. That was the moment I knew Derek Colton, 31 years old, hired 8 weeks ago, and already carrying himself like he'd personally discovered penicillin, had just made the most expensive miscalculation of his young career. My name is Frank Delgado. I'm 54 years old. I spent 19 years at Hartfield BioSciences as a senior formulation chemist, then another 4 years as head of quality assurance and regulatory compliance. I built the compliance infrastructure that kept this company's FDA approvals intact through 3 separate ownership changes, 2 product recalls that I personally prevented from becoming disasters, and 1 audit that would have shuttered the entire Memphis facility if I hadn't spent 11 consecutive weekends rewriting our standard operating procedures from the ground up. But Derek had an MBA from Duke and a mandate from the new parent company, Nexigen Pharmaceuticals, to streamline legacy operations. In corporate language, that means get rid of the people who know where the bodies are buried before they can tell anyone. The irony was I had already started preparing for exactly this scenario 4 months before Derek ever walked through our door. It started when Nexigen announced the acquisition. I'd been through enough of these to recognize the pattern. New ownership, new leadership, new priorities, and a very specific kind of young executive who gets sent in to modernize departments that actually run well. The first thing they do is misread competence as stubbornness. The second thing they do is try to consolidate power by centralizing documentation. The third thing they do is make a mistake they don't understand is a mistake until it's far too late. I started keeping a very careful record of everything on the day the acquisition closed. That morning in the conference room, Derek was presenting what he called the Nexigen integration roadmap. Slides that looked like they were designed for a TED Talk. Lots of gradient colors, very few actual data points. He got to slide 14. I remember the number because I'd been counting and announced that all proprietary formulation data, batch records, and development documentation would be migrated to Nexigen's centralized cloud repository. Full access to the parent company's R&D team. Immediate effect. The room went still. Sandra from analytical chemistry stopped writing in her notebook. Marcus, my assistant compliance officer, who'd been with me for 6 years, looked at me from across the table, the way a passenger looks at a pilot when the turbulence gets rough. I raised my hand. Derek acknowledged me with the slight pause of someone who'd already decided this particular conversation was going to be an obstacle. Would that migration include the GX7 reformulation data? I asked. He smiled the way people smile when they think a question is beneath them. Frank, everything in our systems is covered under the integration agreement, including work developed independently of company resources. He tilted his head slightly. All intellectual property relevant to Hartfield's product lines is now Nexigen's asset portfolio. That's standard acquisition language. I nodded slowly. I just want to make sure I understand the scope. The scope is everything, he said. That's what integration means. I looked down at my notepad, wrote 2 words, closed it, and didn't say anything else for the rest of the meeting. The 2 words were, he confirmed. Because Derek had just said, on a recorded meeting, Nexigen mandated that all leadership meetings be recorded for compliance purposes, a policy Derek himself had implemented that Nexigen intended to claim ownership of intellectual property developed outside of any employment agreement. He'd said it broadly, without qualification, without legal review, without apparently understanding that there's a federal distinction between work developed using company time and resources and work developed entirely on your own. My GX7 reformulation work was the latter. Let me explain what GX7 is, because it matters. 18 months ago, I'd identified a stability problem with Hartfield's flagship controlled release medication. The existing formulation had a polymer matrix issue that caused inconsistent dissolution rates at high humidity, not dangerous, but enough to create batch variability that I knew would eventually attract FDA scrutiny. I brought it to my former director, Patricia, who greenlit a formal investigation but said resources were thin and it might take 18 months to staff properly. I didn't wait. On my own time, my own laptop, my own home laboratory equipment, I'm a chemist. I have a reasonably equipped home lab, which my wife Rachel has never fully forgiven me for taking over half the garage. I started working on a reformulation approach. 12 months of weekends, evenings after Rachel went to sleep, a lot of cold coffee and dry erase markers on the whiteboard I'd hung next to the water heater. My daughter Lily, who's 15 and wants to be a marine biologist, used to bring me sandwiches and ask questions about polymer chemistry that were sharper than most questions I got from junior staff. I documented everything, every synthesis attempt, every failure, every adjustment, every result. Date stamped, signed, witnessed by my neighbor Phil, who is a retired patent attorney and who had been advising me quietly for the better part of a year. Phil had also helped me file 3 provisional patents 4 months before Nexigen announced the acquisition. Those patents were registered under my name, Frank A. Delgado, private citizen, not Hartfield, not Nexigen. Me. The GX7 reformulation, my reformulation, the one that solved the polymer matrix problem elegantly and had already demonstrated superior dissolution consistency in my independent testing, was legally mine. And Nexigen's entire next-generation product launch was being built on top of it, because 6 months ago, Patricia had asked me to contribute my findings to the formal development program. I had, carefully, contributed only the general framework, while keeping the core methodology documented as external input. At the time, I was being cautious. In retrospect, I was being prescient. After the meeting, I drove to Phil's house. He was on his porch with his coffee, waiting, because I'd texted him before I even got in the car. He said it on the record, Phil asked. Recorded meeting. Nexigen's own compliance protocol. Phil set his mug down. Frank, you know what this means. Tell me anyway. It means when they try to submit GX7 to the FDA as a Nexigen-developed compound, they're going to be filing a new drug application that lists protected intellectual property as their own. That's not a civil matter. That's federal misrepresentation to a regulatory agency. How long do we have before they figure out the core methodology is mine? He thought about it. They're planning the NDA submission for the fall investor showcase, right? 8 weeks? 7.5. Phil smiled the way retired patent attorneys smile when they've seen this particular scenario before. That's enough time. I called my younger brother Carlos that evening. Carlos had gone a different direction from me, law school, then 15 years at the FDA's Office of Criminal Investigations before going into private consulting. We'd always been close. He was my best man. His daughter and Lily had grown up like sisters. When I explained the situation, he was quiet for a long time. You documented the independent development timeline? Every step. Phil witnessed the key milestones. Git commits, lab notebooks, time-stamped photos. And they're planning to submit this as Nexigen IP to the FDA, based on what Derek said this morning? Yes. Another pause. Frank, I need you to understand something. This isn't just a patent dispute anymore the moment they file that NDA. Filing a new drug application with fraudulent IP ownership claims to the FDA is a federal crime. I've prosecuted people for exactly this. I know. What do you want to do? I looked across the kitchen at Rachel, who was helping Lily with her homework at the table. Rachel had taken a part-time position at the school district to help with Lily's medical expenses. Lily has a connective tissue condition that requires ongoing specialist visits, nothing life-threatening but chronically expensive. Rachel shouldn't have needed to take that job. I should have been earning enough to cover it without her working extra hours. Derek Colton's restructuring plan, which included eliminating my position within the quarter, would have taken away our health insurance. I want to let them proceed until they've committed fully, I said. Then I want to do this right. Carlos exhaled slowly. Okay, then here's what you need to do. For the next 6 weeks, I did 3 things simultaneously. First, I kept showing up to work, did my job, answered Derek's questions, participated in the integration meetings, said nothing about the patents. Marcus, who I'd brought into my confidence carefully, monitored every internal communication about the GX7 program and forwarded me anything relevant. Second, I worked with Phil to finalize the patent documentation and prepare a formal prior art filing that would surface the moment Nexigen attempted to register GX7 methodology under their name. Third, Carlos quietly introduced my documentation to a contact at the FDA's Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, not as a formal complaint yet, but as a flag for review. I didn't go to HR. I didn't threaten anyone. I didn't send a single email to Derek that could be construed as hostile. I was, professionally speaking, a model of cooperative transition. What I was actually doing was loading the ship while the other side celebrated on the dock. The week before the investor showcase, Derek called me into his office. Frank, I want to be transparent with you. He had the particular energy of someone delivering a speech they'd rehearsed. As we finalized the Nexigen integration, we're going to be restructuring the QA and compliance function. Your role is currently defined as being consolidated. I understand, I said. He seemed slightly thrown by the lack of resistance. We'd like to offer you a transition package. 60 days severance, continuation of benefits through the end of the calendar year. I'll have my attorney review it. He nodded, visibly relieved that this was going smoothly. The showcase is Friday. We're presenting GX7 as the anchor of our product pipeline. It's a big moment for the company. I'm sure it is, I said. I shook his hand, walked out of his office, got in my car, and called Carlos. They're presenting Friday. Everything's in place on our end. The prior art filing is ready to surface the moment they register anything. And Frank, my contact at Cedar, flagged it up the chain. There's going to be someone in that room, Friday, who works for the FDA. I sat in the parking lot for a moment. Carlos, I want to be clear about something. I'm not doing this for revenge. I know. I'm doing this because if they submit a fraudulent NDA and it goes through, someone down the line might rely on safety data that's built on a methodology they don't fully understand because they don't know its actual origins. That's a patient safety issue. I know, Frank. That's why my contact took it seriously. A pause, but also, Derek was going to fire you and take your work. So, yeah, I said. So, Friday morning I drove to the Peabody Hotel in downtown Memphis, where Nexigen was hosting its investor showcase. I had a general attendee badge under my name. These events are technically open to industry, and I found a seat 3 rows from the back, next to a woman in a gray blazer who was taking unusually precise notes for someone from the investment community. The morning sessions were standard: pipeline overviews, market projections, slides with a lot of upward trending arrows. The kind of presentation that's designed to make numbers feel inevitable. I drank 2 cups of coffee and waited. At 2 in the afternoon, Derek took the stage. He was wearing a suit that fit better than anything I'd ever owned. His hair was immaculate. He had the confidence of a man who has never been wrong about something important, and therefore doesn't know what that experience feels like. What you're about to see, he said, is the compound that will define Nexigen's next decade. GX7 isn't just a product improvement. It's a platform, a new approach to controlled release formulation that we developed from the ground up right here at what was formerly Hartfield BioSciences. Developed from the ground up. I wrote that phrase in my notebook. The slide deck was genuinely impressive. Beautiful dissolution curve graphics, stability data across humidity ranges, side-by-side comparisons showing the consistency advantage over the previous formulation. All of it accurate, all of it based on my work. Then came the live demonstration segment, which was, in retrospect, Derek's single greatest strategic error. He decided, at the recommendation of his marketing team, to include a real-time analytical demonstration. They had a portable dissolution testing apparatus set up on a table at the side of the stage, and a junior scientist named Ashley was going to run a live dissolution test on a GX7 sample to show the consistency in real time, in front of investors. The test required the operator to input specific parameters into the dissolution software parameters tied to the proprietary methodology that produced the compound's characteristic release profile. Those parameters were documented in my lab notebooks and incorporated into the formulation through my independent process. Ashley ran the test. The dissolution apparatus initialized. The stir paddles began rotating. The spectrophotometer started logging absorbance readings. And then the software threw an error. Not a catastrophic crash. Something worse, a quiet, specific, technical error that indicated the formulation parameters were inconsistent with the documented preparation method on file. Because the preparation method on file, buried in the regulatory submission documentation that Marcus had carefully ensured remained accurate, referenced my independent methodology, not a Nexigen-originated process. The software was doing exactly what compliance software is supposed to do, catching a documentation mismatch. Ashley looked at her laptop, looked at the apparatus, typed something. The error appeared again. Derek, to his credit, kept his composure for about 30 seconds. "We're experiencing a minor calibration issue," he said from the stage. "We'll have this resolved momentarily." The woman in the gray blazer next to me had stopped taking notes and was watching the stage with a very specific kind of attention. Ashley tried 3 more times. The error message changed on the 4th attempt, which was worse than if it had stayed the same. Because a different error message meant the problem wasn't a calibration issue. It meant the problem was structural. Someone from Derek's team appeared from the side of the room and whispered in his ear, I watched Derek's face go through 4 distinct expressions in about 2 seconds. Confusion, then understanding, then something close to panic, then the performance of control. "We're going to take a brief recess," he announced. The room was quiet in the way rooms get quiet when something has gone wrong that everyone is pretending not to have seen. During the recess, the woman in the gray blazer stood up, buttoned her jacket, and walked toward the front of the room. She handed someone a business card. I didn't need to see the card to know what it said. I finished my coffee and went home. That evening, Marcus called. "Frank, Derek left the building 2 hours ago. They've been in emergency meetings since the demo failed. Legal is crawling all over the GX7 documentation. What are they finding? They're finding that the core dissolution parameters reference an independent formulation development process, and that the independent development process has prior patents attached to it. Your name is coming up a lot in conversations I shouldn't be able to hear. Tommy, how are you doing? I updated my resume 3 days ago. Good man." 2 days later, Phil called to tell me the prior art registration conflict had been formally triggered by the FDA's review process. Any attempt by Nexigen to file an NDA for GX7 under their IP ownership would now generate an automatic conflict flag citing my 3 provisional patents. The flag had been upgraded from administrative to active review, which meant a formal FDA inquiry was now open. I was sitting on my back porch when I got that call. Watching Rachel work in the garden she'd started last spring when she needed something to do with her hands during a stressful stretch of Lily's specialist appointments. She'd grown tomatoes and zucchini and a frankly unreasonable number of herbs that now occupied most of our windowsills inside. "Everything okay?" she called over without looking up. "Getting better?" I said. A week later, the story broke in the Memphis Business Appeal. The headline was measured but precise. Nexigen Pharmaceuticals faces FDA inquiry over disputed GX7 formulation IP. The article was 4 paragraphs. The 4th paragraph mentioned that the company's planned NDA submission had been placed on hold pending review of intellectual property ownership claims filed by a former Hartfield BioSciences employee. Former. They'd officially terminated my position the day after the showcase. The transition package was sitting unsigned on my kitchen table. Carlos called that morning. "Frank, the OCI referral has been formally accepted. This is moving." What does that mean for Derek? It means the question of whether an executive knowingly directed the submission of fraudulently claimed IP to a federal regulatory agency is now being examined by people whose job is to find answers to that question. I let that sit for a moment. "He probably didn't know," I said. "You think?" "I think he didn't read the documentation carefully enough to understand what he was claiming. He saw a valuable compound, saw an opportunity to present it as a Nexigen achievement, and moved too fast to do the legal diligence. He didn't steal it because he understood it was mine. He stole it because he didn't understand it well enough to know that it could be mine. Does that make it better?" "No," I said. "It makes it more common," which is actually the more dangerous version. The following Monday, I had a meeting at the Marriott downtown with the chief scientific officer of Veridon Therapeutics, a mid-size pharmaceutical company based in Nashville that had been following the GX7 story through industry channels. Her name was Dr. Patricia Osman. She was 62, had been in formulation chemistry for 30 years, and got straight to the point within 4 minutes of us sitting down. "We've reviewed your patent filings, Mr. Delgado. We've also reviewed the underlying methodology documentation that Phil Gaines provided. We'd like to license your GX7 reformulation platform, and we'd like you to lead the development program." I looked at her across the table. "What would the role look like?" "Vice President of Formulation Science. Full team, full resources. You'd oversee regulatory strategy as well as development, given your compliance background." She slid a folder across to me. "The compensation structure is in there. I think you'll find it addresses the kind of job security that freelancing the FDA process probably didn't provide." Rachel looked at the numbers that evening and set the paper down on the kitchen counter and was quiet for a moment. "This is real," she said. "It's real. Lily's coverage? Better than what we had. And the tuition benefit applies to her when she gets there." Rachel picked the paper back up and looked at it again. She'd gone back to work part-time because I'd been worried about our financial position. She wouldn't need to anymore. "You planned this," she said. "It wasn't an accusation. It was just recognition. I planned the preparation. I couldn't plan what they'd do with it, but I knew what they were likely to do." "How long ago?" "I filed the first provisional patent 14 months ago." She was quiet again. Then she said, "You never told me you were worried. I didn't want you to be worried while you were already dealing with Lily's appointments." She gave me a look that communicated several things at once, efficiently and without words, in the way that only works after 26 years of marriage. Then she folded the paper, handed it back to me, and said, "Sign it." I signed it the next morning. 3 weeks into my new position at Veridon, Marcus accepted a senior compliance officer role I'd recommended him for internally. He showed up to his first day with a coffee mug that said, "Document everything" on the side. I don't know where he got it. I didn't ask. 6 weeks after the showcase, I ran into Ashley at a pharmacy conference in Nashville. She was with a new company, doing well. She pulled me aside and said she'd figured out, eventually, what had happened with the dissolution test error. "You knew it was going to fail," she said. It wasn't quite a question. I knew the documentation was accurate, I said. The software was doing its job. She thought about that. "Was there anything you could have told us beforehand to stop it?" I considered this genuinely. Probably. But who would I have told? Derek didn't want to hear that the methodology had an origin he didn't control. And if I'd raised it formally, I would have been the former employee who caused problems on his way out the door. Sometimes the clearest way to tell the truth is to let the record speak. She nodded slowly. "What happened to Derek?" "Last I heard, he's consulting independently. Small engagements, nothing in the pharmaceutical space." I paused. "He's young. He'll figure things out." She looked at me. "You're not angry at him?" I thought about my garage lab, the whiteboard by the water heater, Lily bringing me sandwiches and asking questions about polymer chains, 14 months of weekends that Rachel had never complained about, even when I know she wanted to. I thought about the recording from that conference room, Derek's voice saying, "The scope is everything," with the confidence of someone who'd never been wrong about something that mattered. "I was never angry," I said. "Anger is expensive. Documentation is free." She laughed a little at that. I drove back to Nashville that evening on I-40, windows down, the Tennessee October doing what Tennessee October does when it decides to cooperate, cool and clear, and smelling like somewhere worth staying. Rachel had texted me a photo of the garden. The tomatoes were done for the season, but she'd planted garlic for spring. Lily had apparently helped dig the rows and had opinions about spacing that Rachel described as very confident and probably correct. I thought about what I'd told Tommy in those first chaotic days. Document everything. Trust the process. Update your resume. Not because I was bitter, because preparation isn't cynicism. It's respect for the work, for the people who depend on you, for the idea that outcomes shouldn't be determined by who shouts the loudest or who has the fanciest title on the door. Derek Colton hadn't lost because I outmaneuvered him. He'd lost because he'd moved fast through something that required patience, claimed ownership of something he didn't understand, and counted on the assumption that the people below him on the org chart had stopped paying attention. I've been paying attention for 19 years. When I got home, Rachel was in the kitchen and Lily was at the counter doing chemistry homework, which she apparently still found it useful to discuss with me, connective tissue condition and all. College applications starting to feel real in the way that makes a parent's chest tighten and open at the same time. "How was Nashville?" Lily asked without looking up. "Good. Ran into someone from the old company. The one where they tried to take your stuff?" "Yeah." She looked up. "Did you tell her what happened?" "Some of it." Lily went back to her homework. "Good. People should know that doesn't work." I looked at my daughter, who will be a marine biologist, who asks better questions than most adults I've worked with, who sat with me through 14 months of weekend work and never once treated it like an imposition. "Yeah," I said. "They should." Rachel handed me a glass of water and didn't say anything. She didn't need to. That night I sat in the garage for a while. Not working, just sitting. The whiteboard was still there, next to the water heater, dry, erased clean now, but still faintly marked from 18 months of polymer equations and yield calculations, and the particular kind of obsessive note-taking that happens when you know exactly what you're building, and you know exactly why it matters. On my first day at Veridon, Dr. Osman had asked me why my documentation was so thorough. Not just the patents, all of it. The lab notebooks, the witness signatures, the time-stamped photos, the version-controlled files. She said she'd reviewed a lot of independent development records, and mine were in a different category. I'd told her Navy training, which wasn't true. I'd never served, but it felt like shorthand for something accurate about how I approached the work. What I meant was simpler than that. I documented everything because I believed the work was worth protecting. Not because I expected someone to steal it. Not because I was paranoid. Because if you've spent 19 years building something real, you owe it the same respect you'd give anything you actually care about. You write it down, you witness it, you keep the record clean. And if someone comes along and decides what you built, belongs to them now, well, the record knows the truth. You just have to be patient enough to let it speak. Thanks for listening, everybody. If this story hit close to home, if you've ever had someone try to take credit for your work or push you out of a role you built from the ground up, drop a comment below. And remember, document everything. Not because you don't trust people, because the work deserves to be remembered accurately. See you in the next one.